Okay. You can hear me all right. We've got one presentation now, which is like an introduction, and then 3 presentations directly on the principles of creation, which we'll cover today. I realize we've got a very, very varied audience, and you've come here by many different routes. Also, because of the translation situation, it makes it more demanding. But one thing I feel very, very confident about is that when you choose to give such a substantial portion of time to study deeply and to try to find something precious and meet God more deeply, think about life and its meaning, then I'm very, very confident God will come and you will get some special insight, some special things. Probably, this is my way of thinking about it, God's been always waiting to try to speak to us, but he doesn't always get a chance because life is so full, so busy, and we're so much in a sort of a pattern sometimes, and then it's difficult to make the space so that actually we can have that particular mind and attitude which allows God to say something and maybe he wanted to say for a long time and couldn't express. So I am very confident such a thing will happen. I'm trying to adapt the presentations a little bit this particular week because our founder, Father Moon's very determined that we should share further insights beyond the book that David showed you this morning, the exposition of the divine principle. He's been sharing a lot more insights over the past 40 plus years since that book came out. So he's asked if possible we can include some of that content as well. He's actually referring to that as the original divine principle. It's the sort of a gathering together of the exposition of the divine principle and many other insights that he's shared through speeches and other books. So I'm going to try and include some small parts of that as well, but that's going to be a challenge to keep in the time scale. So we'll see how we manage that. And but the purpose is, of course, to share very deeply about Father Moon's own insight, and that's really what we're going to be focusing on. What he expressed recently, those of you who've known his emphasis, for example, his recent tour here in Europe, he's very much wanting to see the world turn in a good direction. And his understanding is people who are spiritually inspired have a role to play towards those who are maybe not so spiritually inspired, and to unite and work together. So he's always talking about this concept of those who have a close connection with God, and he calls that the able side, and we'll look at that a little bit more later on. And then the Cain side, those who are more distant. But how to connect the two together, centered on God, and lift everything up. So, for example, he's talked a lot in recent years about the able United Nations. He's talked about people of spiritual belief and inspiration and righteousness who can make a voice within the United Nations and lift up the whole level of the United Nations to combine with those of great political and economic and social skills and really bring the world into a new era. And he's saying this able UN should be founded on the original divine principle. In other words, he wants to share his insights or offer his insights to draw together people of all different faith and spiritual backgrounds and share some common understandings and be able to work together to lift up humanity. So I'm going to try and include some of that content from those lectures. So this is a little bit from those presentations. So maybe this is an interesting thing to think about. Why to study the divine principle together over the course of these days? Why should we be doing that? What's our goal? What's our objective in doing that? Well, really what this is expressing is we want to solve realistic problems. And where's the core of the difficulties, in a sense? It resides in the human heart. We're going to examine that. So also it's to do with healing healing the human heart. And when the human heart is in difficulty, then of course that's connected, we would say, to the difficulty in not being able to understand who I am and feel the love of God, if you like. And then that manifests itself then from individual trouble to many other different levels of trouble. So here are some of the issues or crises that we're facing as a society today. We can make, of course, a much longer list than that. But if we really want to solve it all, and we'll talk about this later also, we need to make a lot of revolutions in our world. But the most important revolution is, in a sense, the personal revolution. It's how I can transform myself. Because it'd be very difficult to imagine policies making a better world if we don't have better people. Because even you can have good policies and good laws, but if you don't have good people, they'll find their way around the policies and the laws to turn them into something different. So, in a sense, what we're going to be looking at, what we're going to offer as a very important way to address solving my own circumstance and putting my own heart to rights, and on that foundation and beginning to address the realistic problems of the world, is first and foremost to know God. Why know God? Because the point of sorry, just get rid of those interferences. The point is of the principle is that we are not self-creating. We were created. We are created by God. We come from God. God is our origin. So in order to really understand ourselves, we would need to know God. By knowing God, we can get to know who we are and what our identity is and what our purpose is. So we can know ourselves better. And then also connecting to this is developing a stronger relationship with God. And this has also to do, and we'll talk about this more later, getting myself really together and really focused and really clear in my life and what I'm doing with it, so that we're people of integrity, we're people who live what we believe in. This is to do with we'll talk about the unity of mind and body. And then these things then connect beyond myself into my wider relationships, centering on the family. So a lot of the most profound problems that lie behind a lot of the other social problems are to do with the crisis within the individual, which then expresses itself in the crisis in the family. So if we can sort out the crisis in the individual, we can do a lot to resolve things in the family, and that becomes a base to deal with a lot of social difficulties. And what would be the key to all of that? Well, this relationship with God, which permits me to see things from God's point of view. So in a sense, what's emerging out of this is a view of life, an ideology, and a value system that's associated with that view of life. And of course, to bring humanity together to create a peaceful future for humanity, we would need to share some fundamental understandings in common, beyond the difference of culture, beyond the difference of religion. So it's for those sorts of reasons that we're also gathering here together. So this should be helpful for my personal revolution. And then on that foundation, I should be able to be changing what's going on around me. So the expectation would be, after this time spent together, we go back to our families, and then something is altered in myself. And we're refreshed and renewed and revived. And we see our responsibility freshly again, closer to God. And then within our family, within our community, we're able to play a stronger role. So, of course, there are a number of you here who have had a long-term association with the Universal Peace Federation and our ambassadors for peace. So obviously, Father Moon has no, what can I say, authority over you. He's not paying you. You don't belong to his political party. He doesn't have one. So he doesn't have that sort of authority over you. But his concept is that he would touch your hearts. And because ambassadors for peace are very righteous, good people who are living for the sake of others, he would find a way to bind together and be able to really do something to serve humanity. Some of you are here have been long-term religious followers of Father and Mother Moon. And as you probably are aware, I think you're very keenly aware of this, he's always expressing that everybody has a messianic role. In other words, everybody has a role to love the society around them and have be a force for healing. So he's calling all of his long-term religious followers, he's saying, please be a tribal Messiah. Please exert an influence of love and service to the people that surround you. So again, the hope would be that being on this seminar would empower you in that way. Okay. So again, this is from these particular presentations. Father Moon gave a very big responsibility to one of his early Korean followers, Reverend Yu, to share some of his insights, to put his insights together, to put Father Moon's insights together, that are additional elements that can be added to the divine principle, the exposition of the divine principle, and this is drawn from that as well. So he's expressing, why is it so difficult to resolve the problems that we're facing as a world? Well, not surprisingly, after the first slide, it's because actually many times we're either denying God or ignorant of God. That's to say, we don't really know where we come from or why we exist. We don't understand the nature of God. We don't understand the nature that we should have in order to resemble God. And that's a big problem. That's a very fundamental problem. Because without a proper view and without a proper set of values, it's very difficult to put the world to rights. Even if we do have a concept of God, it may be difficult sometimes to take that concept or belief into our efforts to solve the problems. So even if we do believe, then how do we take that belief and employ it and use it as our means of insight and as our guide to actually dealing with the problems? And also another point you mentioned, I think this is an interesting and important point, and very important for religious people to remember, and that is we have got problems. We are not always true and pure and loving. We have a contradiction within ourselves, and we have to recognize that. I was just talking to Lotfi, is it Lotfi, who's here from Libya? You there, Lotfi? Oh, you're right in the front, right? And we were talking about people who've been in power, in government, for many, many, many years, 40 plus years, or 30 plus years, or 20 plus years. When you've been in a position of authority for a long time, it's very difficult to keep right. It's very easy to go off and end up doing things which are not really for the benefit of everybody, even though originally you intended to take care of everybody, do something good for your country. You can often end up doing something that's very selfish and wrong and thoughtless of others and very just for a small group of people, not for everybody. So that's because actually, although we share ideals and we want to make a better world, we have problems. And these problems tend to invade the good we're doing. I don't know if you also experience this. Probably we've got a few husbands here. Husbands, hands up, husbands. Any husbands here? We've got a few wives here. I can't put my hand up for wives. But, it's very demanding being a husband or wife, or maybe a father or a mother, right? Everyone asks you to put your hands up for that. And we probably have a very, very, commitment to those roles. But there are times and moments where we find we fell short of, we're not as good as, we're not behaving as well as, we intended originally. And sometimes very tragically, for example, in the marital relationships, people who started off really wanting to love each other and make something very wonderful together, they end up really impossible to relate to one another and being very bitterly divided from one another. Those sorts of things happen, right? But no one has the big marriage day expecting that to happen. But it does. What's that to do with? It's to do with this type of thing. So we have to recognize that there's contradictions within myself. So that's another reason we can't solve our problems, actually. Or the problems creep up on us and take over everything. So, everybody would like to have freedom, equality, peace, happiness. But, how can we make such a world? Well, that's very simple. What we do is we make sure the United Nations is a really good organization on the world level, and that solves all the world problems, and then that makes it better in the family, and that creates better people. That's the answer, right? Well, that's, that could help a lot, it's true. But more fundamentally, the principal's viewpoint is that the starting point of all the solutions is with myself. I make myself a better person. That makes my family a better family. That makes, of course, it doesn't jump straight from family to world, right? There's a lot of things in between. But this is more fundamentally the point of view of religious people, actually. And I think it's a very valid point of view, right? That's not to say, of course, that we don't need to do anything at the world level or the national level. Of course we do, but we're saying this is more fundamental. So the peaceful world starts from me. So, hey, that's good, isn't it? Because it means we can do something about it. We can contribute. We can make a difference. Very, very important. And where do we make a difference? Well, we'll talk later about 3 key areas to make a difference. The first is how I remain true to my best thoughts and my godly nature by making sure that that sort of mind directs my body. The next one is how I can be a true person to build a true family with my husband or my wife. And the next one is how we can be true people and relate to the world, to the natural world, to the environment in a true way. So we're going to talk about those. Okay, so this is a direct quotation from the introduction to the Exposition of the Divine Principle, that book. I've abbreviated a little bit, but it says here, everyone is struggling to attain happiness and to avoid misfortune. How then does happiness arise? How do we get to be happy? People feel joy when their desires are fulfilled. So when our desires are fulfilled, then we get happy, right? But think about that a little bit. There's a lot of people fulfilling their desires in this world, but doing something not very good. Because they have a type of desire which they're trying to fulfill, which is not a true desire. In other words, it hurts other people, and in the end it even hurts themselves. So there are 2 sets of desires, so it then talks about that. The word desire, however, is often not understood in its original sense, because in the present circumstances, our desires tend to pursue evil rather than good. Desires which result in injustice do not come from a person's original mind. So it's saying in there that we have 2 different types of desire. So we're going to explore this a little bit later on. We have some desires which are, it's saying original. It means the sort of desires through which we resemble the nature within us that resembles the nature of God. And we have another set of desires which are going to make a lot of problems if we pursue them. So when we pursue those desires are going to make a lot of problems, in the moment we may feel a short-term little bit of happiness, but in the end we deeply regret what we did, and we look back on it and we realize we made a big mess. And sometimes you realize that not just on the individual level, you realize that on the historical level. You think about the history of nations or the history of religions and how much we can look back at what we did, and we thought we were doing something good, but now looking back at it, we realize we did something very, very bad as a religion, as a nation. Those sorts of things. So I just want to give an example, which is, I hope is a sort of striking example. This is an example of a person who I would say is following her true desires. But by following her true desires, she's doing things which most people wouldn't do. Because when you first think of them, it looks like it might make you very unhappy. Okay? Now, there are many such examples, but I'm going to pick on an individual, but not be, there are many people one could pick on. And one can even think about this in your own life, which would be extremely instructive. So this is a lady who's in the news quite a lot in these past few years. And as you probably know, she's in Myanmar or Burma. And her name's Aung San Suu Kyi. But I just picked this out as a sort of example. Everybody admires her. She's got a lot of international prizes. In 1991, she won the Nobel Prize for Peace. But she's had not an easy life. And she's made some decisions in her life which I think are really in accordance with her true desire, but they're not the sort of decisions everybody would have made. So I just use this as an example. She was born 2 years before her father was assassinated. He was just at the end of the Second World War, and Burma was trying to get its freedom. Burma, before the war, had been under British colonial rule, right? And then the Japanese invaded, of course, took over that whole area, and then there was a big struggle, and eventually it was recovered. But then immediately after the war was over, the Burmese tried to sort their own independence. And the key figure behind that search for independence, who negotiated with the British government, was actually her father. He was a very, very significant figure for Burma. And he was in the process of making the negotiations and bringing him to a conclusion, and somebody killed him. He was assassinated. Maybe you know other situations like that in histories of nations, very righteous, good people trying to do something very good for their country, and then somebody kills them. Because there's all sorts of rivalries and political differences and tribal differences and things. So he was killed, and she was brought up by her mum. Her mum was also a very significant political figure. She was for a long time the ambassador for Burma in India. Aung San spent quite a lot of her life in India. Then she went to Britain to study, she went to the States to study, and she ended up marrying an Englishman. Quite an unusual Englishman, because he was an expert in Tibetan culture and religion. And so she married him, Michael Aris, in 1972. And they were together. They had, I think, 2 children. And her children were growing up. And he was a professor in England. She had some sort of responsibilities like that. So they were together there in England. And in 1988, her mother got very, very sick. And so she wanted to go back to Burma to look after her mother. But she was looking after her mother, and while she was looking after her mother, all these things were happening in Burma about the whole future of the country. Because essentially, as you're probably aware, the country was under military dictatorship, essentially. And a whole freedom movement came up, and she felt a very strong sense of responsibility as the daughter of her father, who she didn't know because she was a little child when he died, to take responsibility for that. So she stayed in her nation. And she stayed in the nation from then until now, and actually she could never leave, because 2 years after she went back, there was an election, and she became the head of the political party that won the election. It was a democratic election. She clearly won it, but the military regime nullified it, stopped it all from happening, and she was placed under house arrest. And she spent altogether, I think, nearly 20 years under house arrest. So later on, not long after that, her husband contracted cancer. And of course he wanted to come and visit his wife, but the Burmese wouldn't let him come. They wouldn't grant him a visa. They said they couldn't look after his health condition. And the Pope and the Secretary General of the UN, all sort of people tried to intervene. And of course their strategy was they wanted her to leave Burma, go back to be with her husband and her children, because then she wouldn't be there to cause them a problem anymore. But she felt she couldn't do it, she couldn't leave. And she stayed there, and eventually he visited her finally the last time in 1995. Just made 5 visits, I think, up until then. Then they wouldn't let him visit anymore, and he died of cancer in 1999. And of course, not only was she separated from her husband, but also from her children. So in a way, that's not the sort of normal decisions you'd make for happiness, right? Is it? You know, to be separated from the husband you really love and the children you really love. But she was impelled to make that decision. She couldn't avoid it. And where did the strong feeling that she couldn't go home, even though she wanted to for herself so much, come from? It came from her, what we say, her original nature. Or you might say her conscience, or her really good mind, which felt that I have to do something for my whole nation. I have to do something for millions of people. I can't just think about my own family. Do you know what I mean? So she made an extraordinary decision. And you wouldn't normally think that would be a happy decision. But for her, imagine had she made a different decision and gone back and been happy personally, but left her people, then she would have felt very miserable. Do you see how this issue of what makes us happy and what doesn't make us happy is not so simple? So sometimes the most immediate thing that you think will make you happy, in the end, isn't making you happy. It's making you have a lot of regret. So, you know, there's this, you're happily married, you've got 4 kids, they're all growing up, your wife's getting a little bit old these days, and there's a very beautiful girl at work as your secretary, and, you know, you get very close to one another, and, hey, that would really make me happy. But actually, you don't have any serious intentions, you don't have any sincere commitment, you don't really care about that person, you're just thinking about pleasing yourself in the moment. And then you mess the girl's life up, you mess your wife's life up, you mess your family's life up. It wasn't such a great choice. It didn't come from your original nature. Can you understand this type of point? Yeah. So, in other words, the starting point for all the problems is actually in myself. And we're going to examine this point quite deeply. It's a very interesting point theologically. Because who are human beings? If human beings are the creation of God, how come they're in this situation, which we've just sort of illustrated? That we have a mind that's guiding us in a direction that if we follow it, we live a righteous life and we do things which we never regret and which evidently history judges as righteous, good actions and which lead to lasting happiness. But we also find in ourselves another mind, as it says in the New Testament, at war with this mind, which is leading us to do things which are just for my self-centered, immediate satisfaction, thoughtless of the higher purpose, thoughtless of God, thoughtless of other people. And we get this battle. That's why, even though I made very sincere promises when I got married, and I am still married, and my wife and I do still love one another, there have been moments, days, words, things that I wish hadn't been said or hadn't been done during the course of those years. Do you understand? Not so terrible that it didn't work out, but yeah, there were moments maybe when it was getting a bit tough. So do you understand what I mean? That was another side of me, which made me behave the way I knew I shouldn't be behaving myself. And so fortunately, because of my faith and because of my religious insight, usually pretty soon after I did or said something bad, I regretted it quickly and then tried to put it right again. But I'm sure my wife has a very long list of all the things which still remain uncorrected or habitual errors in my misconduct. So, but this is a serious issue, do you understand? It's a serious, serious issue. Because there's nobody who doesn't want to be happy, there's nobody who doesn't want to be peaceful, there's nobody who doesn't want equality, there's nobody who doesn't want freedom. But our world is not full of happiness, freedom, equality, it's not full of those things at all. It's full of the other things. It's full of the things we don't want. Everybody desires to be happy, but not many people are happy. Last thing. Not many people have no regrets. Not many people are leading righteous lives. So, hey, that's not surprising then that the world doesn't work so well either. So this is a very, very serious issue. How can we, if this is true, how can we recognize this about ourselves? How can we see where this is trying to influence us and lead us to act in ways which, if we follow our evil desire and put it into action through our body, we have some thought, some wrong mind, and we enact it, then actually we're going to bring misfortune and sadness. In the long run, it's going to be like that. Because we need to identify that. We need to separate from that. So basically, all the world's great faith traditions are trying to deal with this one. They're trying to uplift your godly mind and encourage you to maintain a life of goodness, and they're teaching you to identify your evil, self-centered type of thoughts and not to put them into action. This is essentially the discipline, the insight that all of the world's great religions are trying to define. So anyhow, unfortunately, in the main, human beings are beings of contradiction. Do you see up there? Beings of contradiction. It means we have conflict within us. And because of that, we tend to head to a life which doesn't work out as well as it should. And where did that all come from? What did that lead to originally? And where do we all come from? We come from a compromised situation. We're going to examine this a lot tomorrow when we study about how we came to have these contradictory natures. But the next point is that this contradiction within the individual then impacts, of course, the family, impacts, of course, the society, impacts all the workplaces, impacts all the institutions, impacts all the governments, impacts everything. So wherever you go in life, you'll find, you know, situations which are not as they should be. When you go to different workplaces, when you work in different institutions, you'll feel tensions, and you'll see factions, and you'll see disunity, and you'll see people pursuing their own. Do you know this type of phenomenon? So this is a very real situation which needs to be dealt with. So we're going to seek insights about this, and it will be very helpful. So, okay, how do we get to be truly happy? Well, actually, as human beings, we have, you know, these two aspects. And we talked about the good mind and the evil mind, and we'll examine that also more deeply later. But basically, if we want to be truly happy, we need to find, yes, of course, material happiness, but at the same time as material happiness, we need to find spiritual happiness. And then we need to be able to put the two together. Now, that's not so simple. Oftentimes, people's search for material happiness is disconnected from their spiritual happiness. That's exactly to do with this point that I've been making. This point I've been making is people act to be happy, right? And they do something through which they want to get happy. Maybe in order to get happy, definitely it would help me to get happy if I had more money. Because, you know, money, things, possessions, position, better clothes, etc., 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 etc. Now, there's nothing wrong with money in and of itself, but the point is, if you seek material wealth, but you are disconnected from your own sense of moral values, your own sense of what's the right and true way to behave, and you compromise your own value system to illegally, maybe not even illegally, immorally, take something from somebody else because you can. Then, although you may get materially more, your spiritual nature is in pain. Do you understand? Yes. Because actually, and you may not notice it at first, right? But you tell me how many wealthy societies are more happy than less wealthy societies. Maybe if you live in a not wealthy society, you think it's blindingly obvious that rich people will be happier. But I tell you, if you look at mental illness, if you look at family breakdown, you'll find generally the richer we get, the more we have problems with our mental health, means our happiness actually in many ways, and the more we have problems with our human relationships. And also you examine in families what lots of the struggles are about. Many, many times they're about material happiness. How to bring the two together correctly is not a simple matter. So we're not saying just, you know, everybody should be miserably poor in order to be really happy. No, it would be good to have the basic things we need in life. But it's very important that that's in accordance with our own spiritual and moral values. So we need the correct connection between the mind and the body, and between spiritual happiness and material happiness. This is crucially important. I don't know if you're into economics at all. I used to study economics, but it's a long time ago now. But if you look at the global economic situation, it's a little bit on the worrying side. Why is it a little bit on the worrying side? Because basically the Western world, especially the rich Western world, is so much in debt to the system. It's unbelievable how much money we've created out of nothing that didn't really exist. It's not connected to real value. And now it looks like the whole game is on the edge of collapse. So banks had a problem, and the government solved the problem for them. But now governments have problems, right? So here in Europe, we're thinking about Greece, where we happen to be now. We're thinking about Portugal. We're thinking about Spain. We're even thinking about Italy. And somebody even said something about France the other day, and hey, Britain's not doing so great either. And you look at America, and it's probably, in totality, of course, it's got a lot more debt than anybody else has. And it's all a bit of a game to try and have more and more things. So we get more and more things, but actually we end up being not more and more happy. Can you understand this type of point? So it's a very interesting point. How do we get the right balance between spiritual happiness and material happiness? Also, not only that, but if we think about this spiritual mind aspect of human beings and this bodily aspect, well, actually also, in terms of solving the world's issues, one thing that will help us to solve it is, of course, our personal integrity, our moral sense, our view of life, our ideology. But in order to resolve that, we need to overcome our ignorance. And in a sense, the ignorance which relates to the material world, or the ignorance of the body, if you like, is resolved through gaining knowledge about the world in which we live, the universe in which we live, the planet in which we live, the solar system, and the wider universe. And to resolve the problems of the mind, or the issues to do with the mind, we need to deeply understand, what is my life, what is its purpose, what's right, what's wrong, where do I come from, what is my identity. So in essence, we've been seeking to resolve our ignorance in this more material realm through scientific research and understanding. And of course we see the incredible potential of scientific knowledge to bring benefit to the world. It's just extraordinary what discoveries may lie ahead of us. Already our world has changed so dramatically, and we can see the potential for science to resolve the problems of want and need and starvation and illness and all these things. But on the other side, it's religion that sought to understand about the area of the spiritual area, the mind area, the origin and purpose of life, the existence of God, life after death, good and evil. And again, the tendency in the modern world is people who are really into science are not so much into religion. Of course, that's not an absolute. There are some very profoundly committed religious scientists, but also people who are into religion, many people would think, are not so much into science. But in reality, because these relate to the two aspects of ourselves, we need these to be in good relationship with one another. So often the claim from scientists is, and historically in many cases it's true, that religious people have imposed themselves upon the scientific sphere and actually blocked development. Because they've insisted on a view of life which they impose not on the areas in which they're expert, but they impose even on the area of science in which they're not expert. And they seek to insist on their dogmas or traditional beliefs and impose them on science. Similarly, from the scientific point of view, because of that sort of history, I think almost as a rebellion against it in a sense. Often they've dismissed the deeper views on life. So there's been a struggle between science and religion. But what the principal is saying is ultimately that needs to be overcome, because religion and science really need each other. I think it's very evident to everybody that if you have huge knowledge provided you by science, but you don't, for example, have morality or good character, then you can use that knowledge to do very many bad things. It's really, really dangerous. So if someone's really bad, selfish, nasty person, it's best if they're stupid and poor and don't have any resources at their disposal. But if they happen to be very clever and powerful, as well as being very selfish and greedy and wrongly motivated, it's a big, big, big problem. So the more we gain technical and scientific understanding, the more we need to grow up and mature ourselves spiritually. Otherwise we find our life being ruined, destroyed by material ability, but no wisdom with which to guide it. It's a big problem. So, anyhow, Einstein said something about it. science without religion is lame, and religion without science is blind. Anyhow, they need each other, it's very clear. I often think it ought to be the other way around in terms of lame and blind, but anyhow. He's very, very clear, they need each other, they really need each other. In fact, what the principal's saying is, and this is an interesting type of point, because can you have a new truth? Is new truth possible? In a way, of course, the nature of truth is to do with underlying principles, which in essence are unchanging. So what does it mean, a new truth? Well, it says a little bit very carefully there, it says a new expression of the truth. And what we're going to look at in a minute is, you know, I don't know if you've experienced this in your own life, but sometimes there's a period in your life in which you feel satisfied by a certain level of religious or spiritual understanding. And then as you yourself grow more spiritually, you reach a point where you no longer feel that the religious beliefs you've been brought up with or that you've held yourself are sufficient to meet all your needs anymore. And you start to feel you need to understand more deeply than you did before. And you start either to research more deeply into your particular faith, or maybe also look at other places as well, because somehow you've grown yourself. And what helped you to grow is no longer sufficient to help you to grow more. So you go on a spiritual search, you know, for deeper truths that can assist you to grow more. You realize there's a limitation to your understanding. The things that you simply believed in the past are no longer enough to answer all your questions and to deal with all the issues you're facing in life. So basically, this is a personal matter. I don't know if you've also experienced this in your own religious life, but people who are spiritually growing, and maybe because of their particular religious affiliation, the religion they belong to, they're reading a particular scripture and studying it. And when they studied it 20 years ago, and they read that particular passage, or they understood about that particular thought, it meant something to them, quite meaningful. But then 10 years later, if they return to that passage, it now means something more to them than it did 10 years before. And again, another 10 years later, or 2 years later, or 3 years later, again, you read it again, it means something different. So there's something in there that you didn't understand before, but now you realized it. Because actually you're reaching greater maturity yourself, and then you're discovering a new expression, even in the same truth that you knew before, but you didn't understand that depth of it before. So, you know, as we change and grow, so we need higher truth in a sense to fulfill our need for a deeper understanding. So, you know, we're faced with questions in our world today, we need answers. One very important matter would be, and I felt this a lot when I was growing up, you know, when I was in my late teens and early 20s, I really felt so crazy that people who essentially believe the same things can't sit down in the same building with one another. So when I was growing up, still between, for example, Protestants and Catholics within Christianity didn't have much to do with one another and wouldn't go inside each other's buildings. You know, in fact, they almost had a feeling that if they did, the lightning bolt would come from heaven and strike them dead. And almost literally like that. And people express so much ill feeling against the other grouping. Unbelievable. So I couldn't comprehend how it could be like that and still be true. And then as I explored more,